What if the weakest voice in one of the biggest bands on Earth turned out to be its most quietly devastating weapon? Ask a casual fan to describe Jin's voice and you'll often get the same shrug. He's the visual, he's the funny one, he's not the vocal powerhouse. For years, that was the accepted shorthand, inside fan forums, in vocal ranking debates, even in the group's own self-deprecating jokes on stage. But here's the question nobody quite stops to ask. If his voice was really that ordinary, why do entire stadiums go silent the moment he sings alone? Why did a professional opera singer, a Grammy voting member, go out of her way to give him a nickname? Why has that nickname followed him for years, resurfacing again and again, long after people expected it to fade? And why, in 2023, did a single tweet questioning his singing spiral into a trending hashtag with ARMY defending him by name? Something doesn't add up. Either an entire fandom, a Grammy-affiliated vocalist, and some of the world's biggest producers are all wrong about the same person, or the story we've been telling about Jin's voice has been incomplete from the start. So tonight, we're not here to pretend the old line about the visual member. We're here to ask a sharper question. What actually happens technically and emotionally when Jin opens his mouth to sing, and why does it keep catching people off guard? That's the question this video is built to answer. Let's set the frame. Jin, born Kim Seokjin, is the eldest member of BTS, the 7-member South Korean group that has spent over a decade redefining what a pop act can achieve on a global scale. He debuted with BTS on June 13, 2013, as one of the group's vocalists, and from the very beginning, the narrative around him split in two. On one side, the visual. Jin was, by his own accounts and the accounts of people around him, initially approached as a trainee partly because of his looks, without a background of formal vocal training behind him the way some of his group mates had. That origin story stuck. It became the lens through which a lot of people, casual listeners, critics, even some corners of the fandom itself, filtered every performance that came after. On the other side, a body of work that quietly, patiently refused to fit that lens, solo tracks that made grown fans cry in stadiums, a falsetto that music critics singled out by name, a Coldplay collaboration, a debut solo single that broke chart records, a discharge from mandatory military service that turned into a global live stream event. None of that happens to someone whose voice doesn't matter. This matters to ARMY, and honestly, it should matter to anyone who cares about how we talk about talent, because Jin's story is really a story about underestimation, about what gets noticed first and what takes years to actually be heard, about the gap between a first impression and the full picture. Here's what we're not going to do tonight. We're not going to pretend every criticism of Jin's technique was baseless. Some of it, from vocal coaches and fellow trainees of the craft, has been specific and worth examining honestly. We're also not going to pretend the praise was universal or invent quotes to make a point land harder. What we're going to do is walk through the actual documented arc of Jin's vocal career, the doubt, the songs, the numbers, the moments, and let you decide for yourself whether underestimated is too soft a word. Because there is one open thread we're going to leave hanging for now and only come back to near the end. What Jin himself said, in his own words, about the exact moment he stopped needing anyone else's permission to call himself a singer. Keep that in the back of your mind. We're building toward it. For now, let's go back to the beginning, back to a boy from Anyang, South Korea, who didn't walk into an entertainment company chasing a microphone. He walked in chasing something else entirely, and singing was never supposed to be the point. Kim Seokjin was born on December 4, 2012 in Anyang, South Korea. He wasn't dreaming of microphones and stadium lights as a teenager. He was a student, later enrolled at Konkuk University with his sights set on acting. Music wasn't the plan. Music found him. The way it's been told publicly for years, Jin was approached by a talent scout, largely on the strength of his looks, and brought in as a trainee for what would eventually become Big Hit Entertainment, now known as HYB. No years of vocal academy behind him, no prior idol training pedigree, just a guy who happened to be in the right place, pulled into an industry that would eventually demand he sing, dance, and perform at a world-class level, starting from close to zero. That origin story is important, and not because it's an insult. It's important because it planted a seed that would follow Jin for the next decade, the idea that he was recruited for his face, not his voice. And in an industry where trainees can spend 5, 6, 7 years drilling vocal technique before they ever step on a stage, starting from behind is not a small disadvantage. But here's the part that gets lost in the shorthand. Starting from behind and staying behind are two very different things. BTS debuted on June 13, 2013. Jin was placed as one of the group's vocalists, not a background role, a frontline one. And for the first few years, the split narrative held. Fans who followed vocal line discussions online, a genuinely popular pastime in K-pop fan spaces, would often rank Jin at or near the bottom of BTS's vocal line, pointing to a smaller range, some strain on higher notes, and stability issues during live, choreography-heavy performances. These weren't cruel takes for the most part. They were technical observations, the kind vocal coaches and trained listeners make about almost every developing singer. What made Jin's case different is what happened next. He didn't disappear into the background of group tracks and stay there. He kept getting handed some of the most emotionally exposed moments in BTS's discography and kept finding new ways to grow into them. The first major turning point came in 2016 with BTS's second Korean studio album, Wings. The album's concept was ambitious. Each member received a solo track meant to explore a different psychological and emotional theme, loosely inspired by ideas of temptation, doubt, and self-discovery. Jin's contribution was a song called Awake, which he co-produced himself. Awake placed Jin's voice in the most vulnerable position it had ever occupied publicly. No group harmonies to hide behind, no choreography to share focus with, just him, alone, singing about fear, about being afraid to dream too big because he was aware of his own limitations, and about choosing to keep working anyway. The song landed at number 31 on South Korea's Gaon Digital Chart and reached number 6 on Billboard's World Digital Song Sales Chart in the United States, a real measurable signal that this wasn't just a fan-pleasing formality. People outside the core fandom were listening too. But the chart numbers were never really the story of Awake. The story was what happened when Jin performed it live. During BTS's Wings tour, their first large-scale international run of shows, members of his own group would later describe the Awake stage as a turning point for how they saw him. Bandmates spoke about watching him grow into the song night after night, about the effort behind what looked on stage like ease. It became one of the earliest moments where the phrase underestimated started to feel less like a fan defensiveness and more like an accurate description of what was actually happening. This is where we hit our first real tension point, because if Awake had been a one-off, a single emotionally timed ballad in an 8-member album cycle, it would be easy to file away as a nice moment and move on. It wasn't a one-off. It was the first data point in a pattern that would repeat again and again for the next several years. Give Jin a song that demands genuine vulnerability, and something happens that doesn't match the just the visual label at all. 2 years later, that pattern would produce the song that ARMY still calls, without much argument, the moment everything changed. But this is only the beginning of that story. What happened with that next song didn't just prove a point about Jin's range. It became one of the most personally significant releases of his career in ways that reporters, band members, and Jin himself would keep returning to for years afterwards. August 9, 2018, BTS was preparing to release Love Yourself Answer, the closing chapter of a multi-year album series that had already reshaped the group's global trajectory. As part of the rollout, they released a comeback trailer built entirely around one member singing one song alone. That song was Epiphany. Written by Bong Shi-hyuk, Slow Rabbit, and Adora, with Slow Rabbit producing, Epiphany was built as a soft rock, slow-building ballad about self-acceptance, about learning after a long stretch of prioritizing everyone else to finally place value on yourself. It's the kind of song that lives or dies entirely on the performer's ability to sell restraint and release in the same 3.5 minutes. There's nowhere to hide in a song like that. No rap verse to break the tension, no group vocal stack to lean on. Jin didn't just survive that exposure. He turned it into what is by wide consensus among ARMY and plenty of outside critics the defining vocal moment of his career. Epiphany charted at number 30 on the Gaon Digital Chart and number 4 on the U.S. World Digital Song Sales Chart. Solid numbers for what was functionally released as a trailer, not even the album's proper lead single, but the chart data undersells what actually happened culturally. Within the fandom, Epiphany became shorthand for a specific kind of emotional payoff, the moment Jin belts through the song's bridge, pushing into higher, more exposed notes after building through a controlled, almost restrained verse and pre-chorus. Fans have described his live renditions, where he often performs the song solo at the piano, as some of the most quietly overwhelming moments of BTS's entire Love Yourself era. And it wasn't just fans saying it. Members of his own group pointed to Epiphany repeatedly as proof of something shifting. Leader RM would go on to describe the song as one only Jin could pull off, framing it as the moment Jin made a piece of music entirely, unmistakably his own. Jungkook, the group's youngest member and himself a widely respected vocalist, would later call Jin the only one who could carry that kind of song, describing him in that context as a genuine main vocalist, not a qualifier, not a consolation title. Here's an open loop to sit with for a moment. Why did it take a slow, stripped-down ballad, not a big, flashy vocal run, to finally shift the conversation? We'll come back to that idea because it points to something real about what Jin's voice is actually built for. Keep it in mind. The following year, in June 2019, Jin released something different, his first entirely independent solo song outside of any BTS album framework. It was called Tonight, co-written with RM and released quietly through SoundCloud as part of BTS's 6th anniversary celebrations. The acoustic R&B pop track was Jin's gift to fans on a day meant for celebration, but the subject matter was anything but light. Jin wrote it about the pain of losing someone close to him, inspired by the loss of a pet he loved. It highlighted a different color in his voice, an airy, almost fragile falsetto over production that shifted between sparse guitar and swelling piano and synth. It wasn't a chart play. It was, by every indication, personal. Then came 2020, a hard year for almost everyone, BTS included. The pandemic had shut down touring, shows, and in-person contact with fans entirely. On December 3, 2020, for his 28th birthday, Jin released Abyss, a sincere, Boomzoo-produced acoustic ballad he co-wrote and co-composed himself alongside RM and producers Boomzoo and P-Dog. Abyss is, by Jin's own account, the most emotionally direct thing he had released to that point. It was written to put into words the feelings of anxiety, self-doubt, and burnout that had been building up inside him. Feelings that, for an idol whose entire public identity is built around performing constant positivity, are rarely allowed to surface this plainly. Some listeners connected it specifically to the isolation of the pandemic era, hearing in lines about closing his eyes and imagining being close to someone, the ache of a performer separated from the fans who usually filled that space. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to write off as a coincidence. 3 years, 3 songs, Awake, Epiphany, Abyss, each one written or co-written in some capacity by Jin himself, each one built around vulnerability rather than vocal showmanship, and each one landing harder with audiences than the Just the Visual member label could explain. But something was still missing from the picture, recognition beyond the fandom, beyond even the wider K-pop press. That recognition was coming, and when it arrived, it wouldn't come from a fan account or a music blog. It would come from someone with actual voting power inside the Grammys. The nickname didn't come from ARMY. That's the detail that tends to surprise people who assume it started as fan hyperbole. It came from Lim Young-ju, a professional opera and opera vocalist who has also served as a Grammy voting member. Describing Jin's voice, she coined the phrase silver voice, pointing specifically to his breath control, his ability to move smoothly between chest voice and head voice, a natural vibrato, and a falsetto she described as unusually moist and controlled for a pop vocalist without formal classical training. This wasn't a passing compliment. It was a technical assessment from someone whose job is to evaluate exactly that kind of thing. The nickname stuck, and it kept resurfacing over the years, from Korean entertainment press, from fan communities translating and resharing the quote, and eventually finding its way onto slang dictionaries as shorthand fans use casually to this day. It's not an official Grammy honor, it's not a certification, but it's also not nothing. It's a working, credentialed vocalist and a Grammy voter on record describing Jin's technique in specific complimentary detail at a time when the louder public conversation was still fixated on his looks. Around the same period, Jin kept adding to a catalog that, piece by piece, was quietly making the case for itself. In 2020, alongside Abyss, he released Moon as his third BTS album solo track, this time as part of Map of the Soul 7. Where Awake wrestled with doubt and Epiphany wrestled with self-worth, Moon turned outward, an ode to ARMY, framing the fans as the reason Jin kept going. It became, for many longtime followers, one of the more purely comforting entries in his solo work, less about internal struggle and more about gratitude. Then, in a completely different register, came Super Tuna, released in December 2021 as a birthday gift to fans. It's a silly, trot-influenced song about the effort of catching a fish, and it was never meant to be taken as a serious artistic statement. But it mattered in its own way. It showed Jin's side of musical identity that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. The accompanying performance video went viral, sparking a dance trend on social media. Sometimes the most telling thing about an artist isn't the ballad that makes you cry, it's the joke song that makes an entire fandom and plenty of outsiders grin without irony. That same year, Jin also lent his voice to television, releasing Yours as part of the soundtrack for the Korean drama Jirisin in November 2021, a solo OST credit that briefly reached #1 on Billboard's World Digital Song Sales chart. It was a reminder that by this point, networks and production teams outside the BTS machine were actively seeking Jin's voice out for their own projects on its own merits. By October 2022, 3 years' worth of these smaller solo releases, Super Tuna, Abyss, and Tonight, finally became available across all major streaming platforms for the first time, having previously lived only on BTS's SoundCloud and YouTube accounts. Overnight, back catalog access met years of pent-up demand, and all 3 songs surged simultaneously onto Billboard's World Digital Song Sales chart, with Jin becoming just the 3rd BTS soloist in the group's history to occupy the top 3 spots on that chart at once. But October 2022 wasn't really about the back catalog. It was about what was coming next, because Jin was about to release his first true solo single under his own name, with a co-writing credit next to one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. And the timing of that release carried an emotional weight that had nothing to do with charts at all. What happened next is the part most casual listeners still don't fully understand, because the song that finally broke Jin into the mainstream American charts was released to launch a career. It was released as a goodbye. In October 2022, BTS's label confirmed something ARMY had been quietly bracing for. All 7 members would begin fulfilling South Korea's mandatory military service. By law, most able-bodied South Korean men must serve between roughly 18 months, generally before turning 30, though the country had adjusted its rules to allow K-pop stars and other entertainers to postpone service until that age. Jin, as the group's eldest member, was the first who would have to go. Before he did, he gave fans one more gift. On October 28, 2022, Jin released The Astronaut, his official solo debut single, co-written with Coldplay, including Chris Martin, Guy Berryman, Johnny Buckland, and Will Champion, and produced by Kygo and Bill Rocco. It was the second collaboration between BTS and Coldplay, following their 2021 hit My Universe. The song told the story through Jin's steady, soothing vocal delivery of connection and love, and it was explicitly framed as a gift to fans ahead of his approaching absence from public idol life. He debuted the song live the very next night, October 29, 2022, joining Coldplay on stage during their concert in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a sold-out show broadcast across more than 3,500 movie theaters in over 70 countries. The commercial response was immediate and, by K-pop standards, historic. The Astronaut topped iTunes charts in 104 countries and regions. In the United States, it debuted at #1 on Billboard's Digital Song Sales chart and World Digital Song Sales chart. On the Billboard Hot 100, the chart that measures a song's overall reach across the American market, The Astronaut debuted at number 51, becoming Jin's first solo entry on that chart and, at the time, the highest Hot 100 debut for a Korean solo artist since Psy's Hangover, and the highest for any Korean solo act that decade. It also made Jin the fifth BTS member to score a solo hit on the Hot 100. Just over a month later, on December 12, 2022, Jin enlisted, beginning his mandatory service and becoming the first BTS member to do so. He trained near South Korea's border with North Korea in Gyeonggi Province. For 18 months, the man whose solo single had just topped charts in over 100 countries was functionally unreachable, a soldier like any other. He was discharged on June 12, 2024. What followed wasn't a quiet return. Big Hit Music's announcement drew Korean and international media to wait outside the discharge site in Yeoncheon. Jin, 31 at the time, appeared visibly emotional as he embraced fellow soldiers and was greeted by bandmates J-Hope, Jimin, V, Jungkook, and RM, the last of whom brought a saxophone to play Dynamite as Jin walked out. Later that day, Jin went live on the fan platform Weverse for roughly 20 minutes, surrounded by celebratory balloons, telling fans, in his own words, that he had cried during the discharge ceremony, but that the 18 months had ultimately been meaningful, a chance, he said, to meet a lot of good people. If there's one moment that captures everything this video has been building toward, it isn't a chart position. It's a night without a microphone doing any of the work. During a stop on BTS's world tour, Jin performed an a cappella rendition of Spring Day, one of the group's most beloved songs, alongside members Jimin and V, stripped of instrumentation, stripped of production, stripped of anything to hide behind. Fans in the crowd described the arena falling almost completely silent, save for his voice. One fan, recalling the moment online, put it simply, it was just him and his voice, and the quiet in the room said more than any applause could have. Another remembered the specific hush of an entire stadium listening to that one unaccompanied passage and calling it something they didn't know they needed. That moment happened, notably, during a period when online criticism of Jin's live vocals had been resurfacing yet again, the same cycle of doubt and defense that had played out in 2023 and would echo again in 2025. And that's really the point. The doubt and the proof have never actually been sequential, one replacing the other. They've existed side by side for over a decade, running in parallel. Jin has never gotten to a place where the questions simply stopped. What's changed is the size of the stage on which the answers keep arriving. That became unmistakable most recently in the summer of 2026, when BTS performed Dynamite at the halftime show of the World Cup final, following Madonna, in front of one of the largest live audiences a performer can face. Jin, in a striking red outfit, delivered the kind of high notes that had once been the exact subject of technical debate among fans years earlier. Jin at FIFA World Cup trended across multiple countries in real time. The nickname a Grammy-voting opera singer had given him years before, Silver Voice, resurfaced once again, this time on one of the largest platforms his career had ever touched. That's the answer to the question we opened this video with. Jin's voice was never a secret waiting to be uncovered by one dramatic reveal. It was a 10-year-long argument made one exposed, vulnerable performance at a time. Awake at 23, Epiphany at 25, Abyss during a pandemic, an a cappella hush inside a packed arena, and a red-suited high note in front of a World Cup crowd. Each one chipping away slightly at a first impression that was never the whole picture to begin with. So where does that leave the underestimated label? Somewhere complicated, honestly, and that's probably the most accurate place for it to sit. The technical criticisms leveled at Jin over the years weren't all invented out of spite. Some came from genuinely trained ears pointing at real, specific things. But criticism and underestimation aren't the same thing, and what the past decade shows is a voice that kept being asked to do more than early assumptions accounted for, and kept finding a way to answer. Jin himself never needed this video to make that case. He made it, one solo track and one live performance at a time, whether or not the wider conversation was ready to catch up. If there's one thing worth taking away from all of this, it's a small act of patience. The next time you hear a first impression about someone's talent in music or anywhere else, maybe give it a decade before you decide it's the final word. If Jin's voice has meant something to you, whichever song did it, let us know which one below. And if you're new to his solo catalog, Epiphany is not a bad place to start listening for yourself.